Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to try to tackle something pretty complex, Cushing's syndrome. Um, Basically, it's what happens when your body's exposed to, high levels of the hormone cortisol for a long time. And as you can probably guess that can lead to some pretty serious issues.
Absolutely. It can really throw things out of whack. And the thing about diagnosing Cushing's is, it's not as simple as just spotting the symptoms. You really have to dig deep and figure out the underlying cause of, why those cortisol levels are so high.
Right. So before we even get into the, different types of Cushing's, our source had mentioned this interesting thing called pseudo-Cushing's. What is that exactly?
Well, Cushing's is really kind of fascinating because it shows just how complex our bodies are. Basically, you have someone who has symptoms that look a lot like Cushing's, but the root cause is totally different. For example, you might see Cushing's-like symptoms in someone who's dealing with a really bad infection or struggling with, things like obesity or polycystic ovary syndrome, or even someone who's, been doing intense exercise for a long
Yeah.
time or under a lot of stress.
Wow. So it's like their body's mimicking Cushing's. That sounds like it would make diagnosing it pretty tricky.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes the whole diagnostic process a lot more complicated. Doctors first have to suspect Cushing's based on the symptoms. Then they have to confirm whether the patient actually has high cortisol levels. And finally, and maybe most importantly, they have to, pinpoint the underlying cause. But when someone comes in with symptoms that could be caused by so many different things, like we see with pseudo Cushing's, it's like solving a puzzle, figuring out if it's really Cushing's or something else entirely.
That makes a lot of sense. So, speaking of causes, our sources go into a whole bunch of different ones. Where should we even start with all of that?
Well, a good place to begin is to understand that there are two main categories of Cushing syndrome: ACTH dependent and ACTH independent.
Okay, so just to refresh my memory, what is ACTH again?
Right. So ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. Think of it like a messenger from your pituitary gland up in your brain. When the pituitary releases ACTH, it signals to your adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, to start producing cortisol.
So in ACTH-dependent Cushing's, is it the pituitary gland that's like driving those high cortisol levels?
Exactly. And the most common cause in this category is what we call Cushing's disease. It happens when a small, usually benign tumor forms in the pituitary gland and starts making way too much ACTH. So you have this flood of ACTH that basically sends the adrenal glands into overdrive, leading to, tons of cortisol being produced.
So the pituitary is really running the show in this type of Cushing's, huh?
Yeah, you could say that. Now, with ACTH-independent Cushing's, the problem isn't in the pituitary. It's actually in the adrenal glands themselves. So they become the source of the excess cortisol, and they're doing it, without any input from ACTH.
Okay, so that makes sense. But what would cause the adrenal glands to just start producing too much cortisol on their own?
Well, believe it or not, one of the most common causes is using glucocorticoid medications like prednisone for a long time.
Oh, right. Those are pretty common for, inflammation and all sorts of conditions.
Exactly. And while they're super useful, if you take them for a long time, it can sometimes lead to what we call iatrogenic Cushing's syndrome, which basically means, Cushing's that's caused by a medical treatment.
Wow, I had no idea. So even, something meant to help can accidentally cause Cushing's. Are there any other ways this ACTH independent type can happen?
Yeah, sometimes the adrenal glands themselves can develop tumors, either adenomas or carcinomas, and those tumors start pumping out excess cortisol. They can be benign or malignant, and each type, can present a little differently.
This is already getting pretty complicated.
Yeah.
We've got the pituitary gland, potentially being the problem, then the adrenal glands themselves, and even medications playing a role.
And that's not all. Remember pseudo-Cushing's. The fact that other conditions and even lifestyle factors can mimic Cushing's makes diagnosing it even more complicated. For example, our sources talk about this interesting link between, chronic alcoholism and symptoms that look like Cushing's. And while the hormonal abnormalities seem to go away when someone stops drinking, it just goes to show you how many different things can cause similar symptoms.
It really makes you appreciate how complex our hormones are and how sensitive they are to, anything that throws them off balance.
Absolutely. And while diagnosing Cushing's can be tough, figuring out what's causing it is crucial for, finding the right treatment.
Okay, so we've got these two main categories of Cushing's, ACTH-dependent and ACTH-independent. But it sounds like there's still a lot more to learn about, what's happening within each of those categories. So where should we go from here?
Well, I think it would be good to take a closer look at each of those ACTH-dependent causes. There's a lot to uncover about how things can go wrong in that, communication pathway between the pituitary and the adrenal glands.
Sounds good to me. This deep dive is already, giving me a lot to think about.
So let's dig into those ACTH-dependent causes, where the pituitary glands is really the one causing the problems. Remember, ACTH is that hormone, the messenger that tells the adrenal glands to make cortisol.
Right. And we're about to look closer at those specific cases where that pathway, gets messed up.
Exactly. So first we've got Cushing's disease. It's the most common form of ACTH-dependent Cushing's. You can think of it like a case of mistaken identity, where a small tumor, usually benign, sets up shop in the pituitary gland. And it basically starts acting like a normal pituitary cell.
Impersonating, huh? How does that work?
Well, it starts producing ACTH just like a normal pituitary cell, but the problem is it doesn't know when to stop. It's like, imagine a factory worker who lost the off switch. They just keep making product even when the warehouse is like overflowing.
Oh, I see. So it's just pumping out ACTH nonstop, and the adrenal glands are getting this constant signal to just, make more and more cortisol.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that the tumor cells themselves aren't like totally unaware of cortisol levels. They have receptors that can detect it, but they seem to have a different set point, a higher threshold for when they feel like they've made enough.
So even though cortisol levels are rising, the tumor keeps sending out those ACTH signals, pushing the adrenal glands to work even harder. Does that make treatment more difficult?
It definitely can, because the tumor cells, they do respond somewhat to cortisol. So some medications can try to, suppress their ACTH production. But it's tricky because you don't want to completely shut down cortisol production, right? Because, our bodies need cortisol to function properly.
Right, of course. It just shows how important that diagnostic process we talked about is.
Yeah.
Not just, figuring out that there's too much cortisol, but also why, and then tailoring the treatment accordingly.
Absolutely. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about ectopic ACTH syndrome. This one's a bit more, I guess you could say, rogue.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
In this case, the problem isn't a tumor in the pituitary itself, but a tumor somewhere else in the body, like maybe the lungs, pancreas, or the thymus. And this tumor, it's gone rogue and started producing ACTH.
So it's basically hijacking the whole hormonal communication system, like sending out ACTH signals when it's not supposed to.
Exactly. And what makes this one really challenging is that, unlike Cushing's disease, the ACTH production from these ectopic tumors, it often doesn't respond to cortisol levels at all. It's like they're on autopilot, just churning out ACTH no matter what.
So even if cortisol levels are super high, these tumors just keep sending those signals, and the cortisol keeps flowing. That sounds really tough to manage.
It can be. These tumors tend to be more aggressive, and treating them often involves, tackling both the tumor itself and the hormonal imbalances it's causing.
It makes you wonder how doctors even find, where the ACTH is coming from in these cases. It's like a medical detective story.
It really is. I mean, they're essentially looking for a needle in a haystack, right? Searching for this rogue tumor that could be anywhere. It takes a lot of careful observation, clinical expertise, and some pretty advanced imaging techniques.
So we've got Cushing's disease, where the pituitary gland is the main problem, and ectopic ACTH syndrome, where a tumor outside the pituitary is the one producing ACTH. Anything else in this ACTH-dependent category?
There's one more, but it's super rare. It's called ectopic CRH syndrome.
Now, you mentioned CRH earlier, but can you remind me what that is and how it fits in all of this?
Sure. So CRH stands for corticotropin-releasing hormone, and it basically tells the pituitary gland how much ACTH to release. You can think of it as like the boss of ACTH.
Okay, so it's like a higher level of control in this whole hormone cascade.
Exactly. So in this rare case, you have a tumor, again, somewhere outside the pituitary gland, and it starts producing CRH. And all this extra CRH basically overwhelms the pituitary, making it produce way too much ACTH, which then leads to, as we know, too much cortisol.
So it's like this tumor is like hijacking the whole chain of command, sending out CRH signals that then make the pituitary go crazy.
That's a great way to put it. Thankfully, this one is very uncommon, but it just shows how many different things are involved in, keeping our cortisol levels in check.
It's incredible, isn't it? We think of hormones as these simple messengers, but this whole deep dive is showing just how intricate and complex they really are.
For sure. And remember, we're still only talking about the ACTH-dependent causes, we still have to look at what happens when the adrenal glands themselves are the ones driving that excess cortisol production.
Right, the ACTH-independent cases.
Mm.
So we've got the pituitary-driven scenarios covered. What's next?
Let's move on to those ACTH-independent causes, where the adrenal glands are the root of the problem.
All right, let's do it. It's amazing how many different ways this condition can develop. All right, so we've talked about those cases where it's the pituitary gland, sending out those ACTH signals and driving the excess cortisol. But now let's switch gears and talk about ACTH-independent Cushing's, where the adrenal glands themselves are like the stars of the show.
Yeah, it's a whole different perspective, right? Because now we're like skipping over that pituitary adrenal communication and looking right at the source of cortisol.
And if I remember correctly, one of the most common causes in this category is, long-term use of those glucocorticoid medications.
Exactly. Drugs like prednisone, they're super effective at reducing inflammation and treating a whole range of conditions. But the thing is, they're basically synthetic cortisol.
So if you're taking them for a long time, it's almost like you're, giving your body a constant supply of extra cortisol.
Right. And while that can be really helpful in the short term, if that extra cortisol sticks around too long, it can lead to what we call iatrogenic Cushing syndrome. Basically, it's Cushing's that's caused by medical treatment.
Wow, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? Like something that's supposed to help can end up causing a whole other problem. It really shows how important it is to, monitor those medications and adjust dosages carefully.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that sweet spot, getting the benefits without the long-term side effects. Now, aside from medications, we also have to think about those cases where the adrenal glands themselves develop tumors.
Right, those adrenal adenomas and carcinomas we talked about before. What's the difference between those two?
Well, both adenomas and carcinomas can cause too much cortisol, but they act differently and, have different chances of spreading. Adenomas are usually benign, which means they stay put and don't invade other tissues. And they tend to be really good at making cortisol, which leads to a specific set of symptoms.
So small but powerful, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Now, carcinomas, those are malignant, so they can spread. And here's where it gets interesting. They don't always produce cortisol directly. Sometimes they make more of the cortisol precursors, the building blocks of cortisol.
So that must look different, clinically than the cases caused by adenomas or even excess ACTH.
Absolutely. It's like a different recipe, and the end result, while it's still Cushing's, might show up in slightly different ways. And get this, some of these adrenal tumors actually have receptors for other hormones, like gastric inhibitory polypeptide, vasopressin, and even serotonin.
Wait, serotonin? That's the mood neurotransmitter, right?
Mhm.
What's it doing in the adrenal glands?
That's a great question, and honestly, it shows how much we still don't know about this whole hormone system. The fact that these tumors might be responding to, signals other than just ACTH, it adds another layer of complexity.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. These tiny tumors in our bodies can make hormones, respond to signals from other parts of the body, and basically hijack our whole hormonal system.
It really is amazing, how complex our physiology is. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive into Cushing's, I want to mention a couple of cases that really challenge how we think about this condition.
Oh, I love those weird outlier cases. They always make you question everything.
Right. So there's this thing called normocortisolemic Cushing's syndrome, and it's kind of a paradox. Imagine someone who has all the classic Cushing's symptoms, but their cortisol levels are normal or even low.
Wait, how is that even possible? I thought Cushing's was all about having too much cortisol.
That's the big question, and researchers are still trying to figure it out. There are a few theories, though. Some think that maybe these people are, extra sensitive to cortisol, so even small amounts have a big effect. Others think maybe there's something different about their cortisol receptors.
So it could be that their bodies react differently to cortisol, or that there's something weird about how their cells receive those hormonal signals.
Exactly. It just goes to show that we still have a lot to learn about how hormones work in the body. And then there's this other head scratcher, biochemical hypercortisolism without Cushingoid features.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does that mean?
Basically, you have someone with high cortisol levels, no doubt about it, but they don't have any of the usual physical signs of Cushing's.
So their labs say Cushing's, but their body's not showing it.
Yeah, it's wild, right? It's like their bodies have found a way to compensate for all that extra cortisol and prevent it from causing problems. Some researchers think maybe it has to do with how their bodies metabolize cortisol or how quickly they clear it out.
It's fascinating how differently our bodies can react to hormonal imbalances. Some people are super sensitive, while others seem to have these like built-in defenses.
It really speaks to the adaptability of the human body, but it also highlights how important individualized care is. What's considered high cortisol for one person might be totally normal for someone else. It all depends on their own physiology and how their body is responding.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored all these different types of Cushing syndrome, from those driven by the pituitary gland to those where the adrenal glands are the problem, and even those strange cases that, make us rethink what we know about cortisol. What are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that our hormone systems are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding or treating hormonal imbalances. You have to consider individual differences, lifestyle factors, and how all these different hormones interact with each other.
Absolutely. And, medical science is always moving forward. What we know about Cushing's today is way different from what we knew just a few years ago. As researchers learn more about hormones, we're going to see more personalized and targeted treatments in the future.
Definitely. And for anyone listening who might be worried about Cushing's or any other hormonal issue, the best advice is to, listen to your body. Pay attention to any weird symptoms and talk to your doctor if something feels off. They can help you figure out what's going on and get the right care.
I couldn't agree more. Early detection and personalized treatment are key. So, to everyone who joined us for this deep dive into Cushing's syndrome, we hope you learned something new and maybe gained a little appreciation for the amazing complexity of your own body. And remember, there's always more to learn. As scientists keep exploring the world of hormones, we're going to discover even more ways to improve our health and well-being.
Well said. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you next time.